Hi, Say More listeners. I want to replay one of my favorite episodes we've done on the show. I talked to author and scholar Richard Reeves about the crisis facing boys and men. As a mom of 2 young sons, this conversation changed the way I parent and the way I think about gender in society. I hope you like it. Welcome to Say More from Boston Globe Opinion. I'm Shirley Leung. The advancement of women and girls over the last half-century has had a dark mirror. Men and boys are struggling. They are less likely to go to college. They have much higher rates of suicide and drug overdose. It's a crisis, but why is it so hard to talk about it? I'm joined today by Richard Reeves, who is the founder and president of the American Institute for Boys and Men. A father of 3 boys, he thinks about this stuff a lot. I do too. I've got 2 young boys at home. His latest book is Of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. Richard, welcome to Say More.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I want to start with something that feels like the obvious. Why is it so hard to talk about how men and boys struggle in our society? Feminism for me, it's easy. This is really hard. Why?
Partly because we're so used to thinking of gender equality and gender issues as basically synonymous with women's issues and girls' issues. And that's for very good reason, because it's been a long and ongoing, continuing fight to get something closer to equality for girls and women. And it feels like all of a sudden it's a bit of a like, wait, what? Boys and men? They're struggling? And I just think naturally it's quite hard for us to hold 2 thoughts in our head at once and to say, okay, there's still a bunch of stuff we really do still need to be worried about for women and girls. But by the way, here's a bunch of stuff for boys and men. So it sort of goes against the narrative I think we have about gender. And we find it quite hard to kind of get past the idea that we sort of have to choose between which one it is. And actually, we mentioned the feminism word. I think to some extent, it's partly a question of whether feminism is a gender equality movement or a women's movement. And if it's a gender equality movement, then what you find is a lot of feminists, and I definitely count myself among that group, are actually quite used to thinking about things through a gender lens. And so that makes it in some ways a little bit easier. But it's a bit odd to think about gender equality for boys and men, but that's where we are now.
I think what makes people listen to you versus rolling their eyes is that you come armed with really compelling statistics about men and boys and how they're struggling. So can you share some of that data?
Yeah, because I think even if we disagree about the interpretation of the facts or how much they matter, we should start with the facts. So in higher education, for example, there's now 60% of the college degrees go to women now, which is a little bit more than the gender gap we had the other way around in 1972 when we passed Title IX to help women. So women are slightly further ahead of men today in higher education, as I said, about 60-40.
And how long has that been true?
Women overtook men in the 80s and into the 90s.
Oh, really? It's a long time.
Yeah, it was amazing, actually. If you look at the charts from the 70s and the 80s, basically what happened was once we stopped artificially stunting the educational opportunities of women and girls, which is what we were doing, they just took off. It was like taking the brakes off a race car, honestly. They blew past men. And they've continued to go past, but more steadily. So if you just look at what's happened in the last 10, 12 years, since 2010, there's been a decline in college enrollment of 1.2 million students. So there's 1.2 million fewer students, but 1 million of those are men.
Wow.
So almost all of the drop in college enrollment since 2010 has been among men.
Wow.
And so that's one example. If you look at something like that happens in high school, like 2/3 of the best high school students measured by GPA are girls. There are 2 girls for every 1 boy in that top 10% of high school achievers, which is why you see the gap at college. And then if you turn to an area like mental health, which is obviously a very big concern, there are reasons to be worried about the mental health of women and girls and of boys and men, but in slightly different ways. So if you take the suicide rate, for example, it's 4 times higher among men than it is among women. And most concerningly, it's risen very rapidly since 2010 among young men. Aged basically men in their 20s and late teens. So last year in the US, we lost 40,000 men to suicide, which just for context, it's hard to know what that number looks like, but that's about the same number of women who died from breast cancer. So these are big kind of health issues that we're kind of facing here. And I'm really troubled by the rise in male suicide. Now, that isn't to say there aren't huge mental health issues facing women and girls as well, but they are kind of expressing themselves a little bit differently.
And why is the suicide rate among young men, why is it accelerating like that?
It's really since about 2010, 2011. And so some scholars, I think, would point to the rise of social media and technology. That's been strongly associated with what's happening to girls. And I think the evidence for that is quite strong for teen girls. It's a little bit less obvious what's happening with boys and young men. But I would point to a couple of things. One is, sure, technology has also come along for them too, but in a slightly different way, in a way that I think sort of pulls them out of the real world, so into more like a gaming world or obviously pornography. And so there's more of a retreat to the tech world, if you like. But I also think that there's just a sense of dislocation and disequilibrium among a lot of young men now, not quite sure how to be in the world, and that's led to some difficulties with mental health. And then last but not least, and this is something that the US Surgeon General has really drawn attention to, is the rise in social isolation and loneliness. But that's been even more strong among young men. So among men under the age of 30, for example, 15% report that they don't have a single close friend.
Oh, wow.
That was 3% in 1990.
Wow.
Now, that's almost 1 in 7 young men saying, I don't have a friend. And you see
that's
survey after survey.
That's because they're online, playing video games,
and
right?
it might depend how they define it and so on too. But it might also be because, look, they're less likely to go to college.
Oh, right.
College is a place to make friends.
Yep.
You make plans through workplace. Well, actually, there's been a decline in labour force participation among young men. So to some extent, it's about the institutions and places where actually male friendships might be formed have become a little bit weaker as well. And it turns out that male friendship takes a bit more work in some ways than female friendship, just on the average. And so as those institutions have fallen away, and frankly also I think as women have stopped doing quite a lot of the emotional labor for men, you know, I think that your girlfriend, wife would quite often do some of the heavy lifting socially. I think a lot of women are saying, no, that's not my job. You need to do some of that yourself.
How does race and class play into these trends?
Well, hugely. It's quite clear that the biggest gender gaps that we see in all of the measures we're probably going to talk about today are to be found towards the lower end of the economic spectrum. So this is working class men. So in employment, for example, most American men in 2019 were earning less than most American men were in 1979. Controlling for inflation. But that wasn't true for men at the top. Upper middle class men, professional men were doing better because of the rise in wage inequality. But working class men were actually a little bit worse off than their fathers were. And then if we look at race, what we see is a particularly sharp gender gap between outcomes for black boys and men and black women and girls. So all of these differences are magnified when you look at them through the lenses of class and race, and in particular when you look at the issues of black boys and men.
Why are working class men in so much financial trouble, I guess?
Well, they have borne the brunt of the changes in the economy, right? So you write a lot about the economy, so it's not a secret that there's been a move away from manufacturing, mining, heavy industry, all of those jobs that traditionally men were able to do. And actually, they're very often able to do them even with relatively low levels of education, right? And particularly if they were white. And so some of this was about the exclusion of women and men of color from those roles, to be fair. But it did mean that, like, if you were a guy, even if you had a high school education, there were jobs for you. The unions were pretty strong in the post-war years, and so you could do kind of pretty well. Those jobs have not completely disappeared, but a lot of them have gone away. So I think that's something that's just happened on that side of the economy. It's just there are fewer jobs that are there for men. And then the second thing that's happened is that, particularly among working class men, like marriage rates have plummeted. And it turns out that actually married men are much more likely to be in employment, they're much more likely to be in the labor market. And so as women have become more economically independent,
we don't need the men.
Right. I mean, you put it bluntly.
We don't need men.
But it is the question, right? Like, do we need men? And actually, what we need men for is a question that, like, it's,
I guess, to have babies.
It's fun, right?
To continue the human race.
I mean, what was it? Actually, Maureen Dowd, the New York Times, she She wrote a book called Are Men Necessary? And her mum said yes for babies and heavy lifting.
Right.
But of course,
Literally heavy lifting.
There are apps for both of those things now. And so it's not clear. But actually, so behind all of that, there is actually quite an important anthropological question, which is if women achieve a significant degree of economic independence, so that we have broken that economic dependent model of marriage, which is great to the extent that's true. It's obviously a huge liberation. I mean, it was kind of part of the point. It does then raise the question, which is, okay, so we're getting rid of this old model whereby we needed men to be providers to some extent. If that's not true anymore, then what are men for and what is their role? And I think that question of what's the role of men in a world of much greater gender equality is one that we're not properly addressing. And I don't think it's the job of women to answer that question. I think it is obviously much more the job of men. But right now, the only people who are even asking that question are very often those who are online and of a more reactionary hue. And so there's this sense of like, men are lost. You know what we should do? We should go back. Right? Because men knew who they were 40 years ago. They don't know what to do now. So, you know what we should do? Go back to the world we once knew. And instead, what we need to do is go forward, but with a degree of compassion and empathy towards men that I think has often been lacking.
So I'm sure you hear this a lot. So just as women are making gains, the men start complaining. And so what if this is just a temporary setback for men?
It could just be an adjustment period. I feel this myself, which is you have let's say 10,000 years of patriarchy, right, where women are kind of behind men and lacking rights in many ways, and still to a large extent in many parts of the world, and still underrepresented in positions of power across the economy and society. And then on a few indicators, men start falling behind. Suddenly, we're panicking. It's hard to suddenly start saying, okay, now I'm going to worry about boys and men. Like, really? Like, after a nanosecond where they're falling behind. But I just think as parents, as citizens, as community members, like if there's a group that are falling behind or are struggling on a particular dimension, we should pay attention to that. And the thing is, like, if you're a 27-year-old guy now, you're just in the world now, right? You're not thinking about the 10,000 years of patriarchy that came before you. You're just struggling. And I just think at some level, we have to just be aware of the fact that a lot of boys and men are struggling right now. And to neglect that problem because of the history that has typically on the side of men would be, I think, unfair on this generation of men.
I mean, do you think the Me Too movement, which I think was 2017, became a very popular term, do you think that's having an effect on men and boys and their ability to feel a part of society? I mean, is there a backlash against boys and men because of Me Too?
It's very difficult. It becomes like pinball, doesn't it? Because the Me Too movement was itself a kind of reaction against, some really kind of terrible behavior of men in the workplace. But also it was related in the US to the rise of Donald Trump and the Women's March. And so there's just a kind of general sense, a real growth in solidarity among women. I think by and large, my sense of this is that there are very few men who don't think that we absolutely should be treating women differently and more respectfully. And the Me Too movement was a necessary and long overdue corrective to some of the attitudes that prevailed, especially in the workplace. But I think some of the products of the Me Too movement, such as the rise in the use of the term toxic masculinity, the sense of like something being wrong with men rather than just a movement to kind of liberate women from the harassment. I think that is creating a backlash. And so it's interesting, Gen Z men now are less likely to say that they support feminism than older men are. There's been
really?
a real shift against feminism among younger men. But if you actually ask them, do you think women should have equality of opportunity? Do you think women should be equally educated? They all say yes. So they're in favor of gender equality, but they're not in favor of feminism. And I think that group of men came to see what came out of the Me Too movement as not just pro-women, but as anti-men. Toxic masculinity, mansplaining. And so rightly or wrongly, and I think my view is somewhat rightly and somewhat wrongly, a lot of men have formed the impression that post-Me Too, it's men themselves who are seen as the problem. So I think Me Too movement, amazing. Rise in the use of the term toxic masculinity, quite indiscriminately in many cases, not so helpful, and is pushing a lot of men away from this conversation rather than bringing them in.
And since you've written your book and started your institute, I mean, do you get pushback for your ideas about men and boys?
Online, yes. I mean, if you spend, we all have enemies online, right?
Yes, we do.
I mean, we're not doing our jobs if we don't have some enemies online, but generally at the fringes, I would say. One of the things I've been really encouraged by since doing this work in the book and now the Institute is that if you stick to straightforward issues that are clearly a problem, like mental health, education, opioids,
and your facts and your statistics, yeah.
And you refuse to play the zero-sum game that people will play on both sides, which is like, well, if you care about boys and men, it means you can't care about girls and women, which is crazy. And you frame it that way. Actually, a lot of people have sons they're worried about, brothers they're worried about, husbands they're worried about, fathers they're worried about, or they can see the trends just generally in society. And so if you create the right tone and permission and fact base for this conversation, most people see that there is an issue with a lot of these boys and men, and most people do want to address it. You just have to stay away from some of the kind of frothier culture war-y stuff. So one of the sound bites one of the mantras, I should say, within our institute now is keep it boring.
Oh, that's good.
Boring is good. I think boring's the new sexy, honestly, and at least I hope
like
so, because
that.
that's
Keep it
me.
boring. So what's an example of keeping it boring?
Focusing on-time high school graduation rates in different U.S. states. So in Michigan, 60% of black boys graduate high school on time, right? 15 percentage points less than black girls. One of the other things we're working on is the fact that the share of male teachers has really plummeted. It was 33% of teachers were male in 1980. It's now 23% and falling. Yeah. And so we're working with some school districts and some states to say, look, do you think it would be good to have more male teachers? Most of them say yes. Okay, what should we do about that? What are those problems? So those technical high schools, apprenticeships, I can keep boring you. I can bore you to death.
Yeah, these are boring. Are you bored?
This
is good.
Right,
I am bored.
Right. You notice I haven't mentioned the Barbie movie or drag queens or any of that. Because the truth is that whilst I'm not saying there aren't issues in those other areas, it's actually most people are worried about these much more straight, and they're worried about health and education and employment and family life.
Right. More of my conversation with Richard Reeves after this short break. So you have a radical idea to help boys. It's this concept of redshirting all boys, holding them back a year, start kindergarten 1 year later than the girls. So explain why you think that could help boys.
Well, when I looked at the difference in educational outcomes between boys and girls, you see a couple of interesting things. One is that the standardized test gap just isn't really there anymore, right? On SAT and ACT and stuff, there's not really much gender gap. Like, girls aren't smarter than boys, and boys aren't smarter than girls, right? So in that sense of just intellectual ability, there's really no difference. But on GPA, girls are killing it, right? So they're way ahead of boys on GPA and extracurriculars and so on. And you say, well, why is that? And then as you kind of look into the neuroscience, it turns out that particularly in middle and high school, the girls are just more advanced. They hit puberty earlier, which means their frontal cortex goes earlier. And the frontal cortex is the bit of your brain that has you do your homework, right? That makes note of the homework, remembers to do the homework, does the homework.
Charge your iPad every night.
Charge your iPad. Organize your book bag. So that
Don't forget your wallet. Yeah, yes, I know.
All that stuff, right?
Yes.
And actually a good test of this would be like go into a ninth grade classroom and ask them to open up their book bags, right? On the average, the girls' book bags will be reasonably well organized. The boys' book bags will be like a controlled explosion. And it's not the boys' fault. It's just that those non-cognitive skills, that's what the social scientists call it, like organization, planning, future orientation, just a little bit less advanced. So it's not the girls are smarter than boys, but they have got their act together earlier than boys, right?
That's right.
So if you have an education system that rewards you for having gotten your act together,
you're always going to have better grades.
You're always going to have better grades, right? So girls have better grades. And so what do we do about that fact? It is about a year. Like the girls are about a year ahead in the development of that frontal cortex and those non-cognitive skills. So my thought was, well, why don't we just level the playing field by making the boys a year older? And the way you do that is by starting them in school a year later. Now, it doesn't have to be a year. It doesn't have to be everybody. There's various options, and we're talking to some school districts and states now about trying different models of this. But the idea basically would be to say, if we know that boys mature a bit later than girls on the average, why not build that into our education policy by just starting them a little bit later?
So I have two boys.
How old are they?
They're 11 and 13.
Okay.
And my 13-year-old this year just started an all-boys Jesuit school, Boston College High School. And they actually market themselves or talk about it's so hard for boys today. The principle of BC High talks about, I remember at orientation, talked about this generation of boys, they face the most challenges in terms of finding themselves. What is the identity of boys and young men today? And so I think those of us who decide to send our kids there, like our boys there, we recognize that. We recognize, especially the personality of my 13-year-old. I recognize that he would just thrive at a place like BC High because it's an all-boys environment. There are, and I didn't even think about the male teachers, but he has a lot of male teachers,
And that comes with the territory in a boys' school. Now, it might be that if we could have more male teachers in other schools, I mean, that's one of the big things I'm arguing for that could be good. But there's a broader point there, isn't there, which is this sense that mainstream education, and maybe to some extent the kind of culture right now, isn't always that boy-friendly. And if we want them to develop, into the sort of young men that we hope they'll be, that might in some ways be easier in that single-sex environment than it would be in a co-ed one, especially actually if we want boys to learn some of those more interpersonal skills, so sharing skills, etc. And so I think some of the arguments that used to be made in favor of girls' schools, which is that for girls to develop well, it's better for them to kind of be away from boys, might now apply the other way around, but even more strongly, in fact, because very often, this is certainly the experience I've had with one of my sons in particular, is that it honestly felt like he was a square peg, being forced into a round hole in terms of mainstream education. And it is to my great shame and regret that honestly I was the hammer. I was the one driving him in and basically saying, change, be better. And with hindsight, I now realize that the system just wasn't that well geared to him, partly because of some of his more boyish traits.
Right.
And there I was ramming him into this non-male friendly education system in a way that I thought was actually probably quite damaging to him. But I don't think we're alone as parents in feeling like mainstream co-ed education isn't quite the sort of education that's going to serve our boys as well as we would like.
So much of male identity is wrapped up with being the strong one or being the confident one. And so, given how the roles of men and boys are changing, and also women, right, and girls, I mean, how do you view, what should be the identity of men and boys now?
One of the things that troubles me most is actually the lack of agency that you see among a lot of boys and young men. And I think that's partly because the script for women and girls now is quite rightly about liberation and autonomy and like, you go girl, girls on the run, girls who code, get educated, be independent. Amazing.
So what is it? What is the corollary for boys?
And there isn't one. And the reason there isn't one is because we think historically, we haven't needed one, right? And so what we've done is we've replaced the old script, if you like, for girls and women was you're going to find yourself a husband, you're going to raise kids, etc. That was my mum's script, right? And the old script for men, which is like you're going to be a provider, you're going to be the head of the household, etc. We tore up those scripts, but we replaced the female script with this new one we just discussed, this wonderful, empowering one. What's the new script for boys and men now? What are we telling boys and men? What's our message to them about who we want them to be in the world? And the answer is there is no message. So without a script, they're improvising, they're not sure what to do. And I was really struck by something a young man said to me not that long ago, where he said, I know all of the things I'm not supposed to do. And not supposed to say. I have no idea what I am supposed to do or what I am supposed to say. And so the debate about the role of kind of men, boys and men has been framed largely negatively. Like, don't do this, don't say that, rather than kind of positively. And of course, it's a difficult task to figure out what that positive message is going to be. But one result of that, I think, has been this retreat. We see men retreating from relationships. They're dating less, they're having less sex, they're traveling less. Women are much more geographically mobile than men now in the early years. Twice as many women sign up for the Peace Corps. Twice as many women sign up for AmeriCorps. Twice as many women sign up for student government. So there's an agency about women and young men, which is wonderful and glorious. But a passivity, uncertainty, retreat among a lot of young men. So ironically, this idea of like men are the confident ones, men take the lead, men are the ones who are agency, go west, etc. Turns out the opposite is true now. And a lot of young women will very often complain. Their complaint about young men might be that they're all toxic and predatory and harassing, etc. Might be. Typically not that's what they say about young men, actually. What they're more likely to say about young men is, I wish he could just make his mind up, decide what he's going to do. They don't want men to be less in order for them to be more. They want equals. They want men who will be their equals, eye to eye. And a lot of them are feeling like, for whatever reason, a lot of young men just don't know quite how to be in the world.
And I guess because as a society, we don't know how to talk to boys and young men. We don't say anything to them.
No, we know, we know, as I said, what not to do. In fact, one of my sons came back from their social skills, emotional, whatever passes for sex education in their school. And it was all about like relational skills. And I said, what did you learn? And he showed me, and he said, I learned 23 things that I'm not supposed to do or say.
Wow.
And I looked at the list and I was like, I agree with that list. Right? And this is important. This is an age of consent. This is an age of understanding. I get it. And I said, and is there a positive list? No. So all he had heard was the don'ts. So we have a long list of don'ts for young men. Good. But we do not have a list of do's. And that makes them quite risk averse and quite prone to retreat. But then along comes figures in the manosphere, men online. There's men's rights movements. So the manfluencers is what Christine Ember from the Post calls them.
I haven't heard that term.
Yeah, it's great. Christine came up with it. Manfluencers. But Andrew Tate is the kind of example that many people will know. If they're under the age of 30, they'll definitely know.
Yeah.
But you have these figures who do have an answer to the question of how to be a man. It is a reactionary answer, but it is at least an answer.
Mm-hmm. So I, like you, have no daughters, just 2 sons.
Yeah. Someone has to do it. It's glorious, though, isn't it?
It is.
Boys are great.
So what's the best advice you have for parents of boys?
Well, the first thing to do is don't do what I did and lack empathy or compassion, right? I don't have daughters, as you say, but nonetheless, I know that part of my thought process as my boys are struggling, especially in education, was why can't you be more like your sister if you had a sister? Why can't you be more like your female classmates? Why are you so disorganized? Why do you forget everything? Why, if you go to all the trouble to do the homework, would you then forget to turn it in? Right? What's wrong with you? Right?
This is all my conversation every day.
And I'm like, with
my 13-year-old.
And I just didn't.
So don't say that.
I didn't understand.
Well, that's my conversation all the time.
And this is now becoming a one-on-one session, which is very useful for you. Right?
And my husband can empathize. He's he's just a 13-year-old boy.
This is everyone.
Okay, so what should I say then?
Well, you should say, you should help him. You should do it for him to some extent, right?
Oh, I do that.
Right, and do so gladly.
I'm like a chief of staff for my son.
a very dear friend of mine at Brookings Institution, Camille Bousset, she said she sat her son down when he went to high school and she showed him all the charts about the frontal cortex and she said, the education system you're entering thinks you have a developed frontal cortex, right? You don't. I am going to be your frontal cortex for the next 3 years. Okay? I'm going to be your stand-in frontal cortex. In other words, like, I'm just going to be on it. And he's like, okay. And that's what, and actually that was an incredibly wonderful way of thinking about it because she's like, I'm not rolling my eyes at him all the time and asking what's wrong with him. I'm understanding that the education system has got an assumption about his development, which is not true. And so I'm just going to gladly and uncomplainingly compensate for that lack rather than what I think that, and teachers do this as well, some parents do it, we fall into the trap of treating our boys like defective girls. We take a feminine standard, a female standard for how to behave, how to pack your book bag, how to do your homework, etc., how long you can even sit still for. Right? We've cut recess, we've cut extracurricular, right? Based on, I think, a more female standard. And so, for example, I'll give you an example from my personal life. We hired a male carer for our kids when we needed a little bit of help. And I came home one day, and this male carer, when our boys were in school, there was a tent pitched in our front yard. And they were all in there.
Oh, wow.
With the book. I said, what's going on? And he said they didn't want to do their homework. So what we did was we said, okay, let's pitch a tent and we'll do the homework in the tent. And then after each assignment, we'll go out and we'll throw the rugby ball at each other for 5 minutes and we'll go back in the tent and do the homework. So I did the homework in the tent.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, actually, amazing. Right? And I'm betting you, if I had had daughters, they probably wouldn't have had to do that.
That's right.
But with him, he did it. And as a guy, he just instinctively knew, hey, let's pitch a tent and throw a ball around. That just kind of came with the territory. And we just don't have enough of that in our institutions anymore.
Well, Richard, I know what I'm going to talk to my sons tonight at the dinner table about. Anyways,
good luck. Hope it goes well. You're obviously a great mom. And I just think the fact we're having this conversation in a compassionate way in a more empathetic way, not in any way to let anybody off the hook. Just so many of our boys and young men feel that they're just not being seen or heard. I've had a bumpy road myself of doing this. I know I've lacked some compassion here and there with my sons, but oh God, I love them and they're great. And, you know, boys rock if we get it right, just as much as girls do.
They do. Well, Richard, thank you for coming up to Boston. Your latest book is Of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About it.
Thanks again.
Say More is a production of the Boston Globe. Today's episode was produced by Anna Kusmer with help from Alexis Sargent and Scott Hellman. Our editor is Jim Dow. Our engineer is Uzair Ahmed. Our music is from APM Music. If you like the show, please follow us and leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email us at saymore@globe.com. I'm Shirley Leung. Thanks for listening.